Hey everybody, it's Sean. In today's tutorial, we're going to be walking through some basic preferences that you guys might want to adjust in Photoshop to make sure that it is running as smoothly as possible and is optimized for you if you're kind of new to it. And so with that being said, let's just jump right in. So I have Photoshop open here, and if we go up to the top where it says Photoshop, there is a preferences section. If you're working on a PC, it'll be under edit, and then preferences are at the very bottom. So I'm going to go ahead and just click on the general tab for our preferences and open our preference window. Great. So right off the bat, we have some options here in the general tab. I would like to leave the color picker as Adobe. This is referencing a color space, which we'll get to in another video. The HUD color picker, this is just an interface setting. You're more than welcome to change this. However, I just leave mine as small, and interpolation by cubic is totally fine. Now, when we're looking down at this option section here, we have a few things that we could take a peek at. The first thing being auto update open file based documents. You don't need to worry about that so much because it's just not something that will really come into play with your workflow very often. Auto show the home screen. This is right when you open up Photoshop here. So if you don't like seeing your home screen with all of your recently opened documents, you can uncheck that if you'd like. The legacy new document interface, this takes you back to using something from Adobe CS6. So if you like using the current CC interface that's consistent across all platforms, don't worry about selecting that. Skip transform when placing images. When you bring in a new image into a Photoshop document, if you like the ability to automatically start scaling and transforming your objects, then leave this unchecked. If you check this, it will skip that step and it will just sort of plop your images right in there. Legacy free transform, unless you guys are really used to how the old way of transform used to work, then you could check this. But if you're quite used to how Photoshop operates in terms of being able to scale images, then just leave this. This option was really necessary a couple of years ago when Photoshop actually changed the keyboard commands for scaling stuff, but I have a feeling you guys are pretty much used to the new way, so we can just leave that. Beep when done. This is kind of a funny option. Sometimes your PSDs can take a while to save if they're large, and if you happen to walk away from your computer or switch tasks, then this beep might be something that's useful for reminding you that your work is saved. Export to clipboard. This one is a big one because it can really have a negative impact on your computer's performance. If we were working on a large Photoshop document and you were trying to copy and paste multiple elements from it from Photoshop maybe into InDesign or into another program, those clipboard file sizes can be massive and really eat up a lot of the RAM in your computer. And considering the majority of us are probably working on MacBooks, we don't have a lot of RAM to spare. So what I would say is uncheck this, and then just know that when you have to transfer elements from one program to another, it's best to save your document or like section out the specific elements you need and save them individually and bring those into the new program rather than just copying and pasting directly from Photoshop. Not only will it kind of help to keep you a little bit more organized, but you'll increase your computer's performance while doing so. So resize images during place, I definitely would recommend keeping that on, and then always create smart objects when placing. Please leave this on as well. I'll be covering some tips about non-destructive editing versus destructive editing in a little bit, and this option really helps to keep you from being a destructive Photoshopper throughout your experience here. So let's just make sure that that guy stays on. Next thing is your appearance panel. I don't really change a whole lot in here personally. If you're someone who really, really likes the dark theme, you can go even darker than Photoshop's standard dark gray color. The highlight color, right now, we can see over here where it says background, it's sort of a light gray tone. You could change this to blue, and you can see over here. and you can see over here that it has switched it to a bluish color, which is wonderful. So totally up to you what you like. I'm probably going to leave mine on blue because it'll be easier to differentiate things later on. The rest of this is kind of up to your own sort of choosing. It's just about what mode you'd like to be in, which we sort of just covered, the border of the actual, app itself, all that fun stuff. So you can sort of take a look there. The next thing down here under presentation, this is just your language setting, English, obviously. We can work in that. If you had another language installed, you could probably select it from there. And then UI size, font size. If you have poor eyesight or you just want to be able to see things a bit easier, you can change this. And you have to close Photoshop for the effect to take place, but you can change the size of the type on your user interface. So kind of useful for people with poor eyesight. It's a nice accessibility feature and, works pretty well. So the next thing we can go into is your workspace. And this basically, some people don't like working in this full screen window. Some people don't like using tabs as documents. So, there's some options in here for you to be able to play around with. Personally, I just like the default, so I don't really fiddle around with it too much. Okay, and moving on into tools. Tool tips is kind of a fun one if you're learning Photoshop. You can see if I hover over this and this little yellow window pops up saying determines whether to shoot tool tips for controls and tools. That is a tool tip, right? And so you can hover over any tool in Photoshop and it will show you a tooltip if you sit there long enough. Kind of useful when you're learning. If you're already experienced or you find that annoying, you can uncheck that if you would like. I will leave it there anyways. The shift key for tool switch, this is a big one. I'm definitely going to tell you to leave this enabled and I'll show you why. So I'm just going to exit our preferences, but I'll join you back here in a second. And so if I hit OK, this is a photo that I had open, and let's say we wanted to use the lasso tool for selecting something, right? So I have my lasso tool and I can just quickly make a selection. There we go. I've developed a nice circular selection. But let's say I didn't want to use just the free transform lasso tool, but I wanted maybe the polygonal lasso tool from underneath it. So instead of clicking and holding to get the polygonal lasso tool there, you can see they all use the L key as their shortcut. But if I just press the L key, you'll just see it will jump me to whatever lasso tool I previously had open. But if you hold the shift key followed by the L key, it will switch between all three tools that hide underneath this one sort of general lasso tool itself. So making sure you leave on that shift key to toggle is a really sort of important setting to keep on if you are like me and you don't like taking your hands off the keyboard too frequently. Okay, so where was I? Shift key for tool switch. Leave that on, please. Double click, layer menu launches select and mask workspace. That's good. Yep. I think the rest of these, they're fairly standard. Again, these are all things, they're preferences, right? So whatever you really think works best for your workflow, you can come in and adjust these things. It was really just sort of those two things for newbies and just general good usage that I wanted to point out. File handling. This is in here actually something that we should take a look at. Automatically save recovery information every 10 minutes. So the thing here is every 10 minutes is a nice setting. It's good if you have good computer performance and your computer's not too junked up with stuff. If you find that Photoshop is running slowly or your computer is running slowly in general, you can jump this up to 15, 30, or 1 hour. The only trade-off obviously is that if your computer crashes or Photoshop crashes, you will have a backup that is further out, right? So you'd have a backup that was 15 minutes prior, 30 minutes prior, or an hour prior. And depending on how long you're working on files for, this may or may not be useful. So I would recommend just leaving it at 10 minutes, but I just wanted to let you know that it is there. And so this brings us down to file compatibility. We will look at Adobe Camera Raw and what it does in a little bit, but prefer Adobe Camera Raw for supported RAW files. This is going to be pretty useful because Camera Raw allows you to extract the most amount of information for the largest file size, which is, or for the largest file type, which is Adobe Camera Raw. We do not need to worry about using Camera Raw to convert documents that are smaller bit sizes. Just leave that. Ask before saving layer tip files. You guys might actually get benefit from this, but if you find that it is sort of tedious every time you go to save a tip file for printing, you can uncheck this if you'd like. And then this, if you guys use the cloud documents sort of feature, then you can obviously set a directory about where to find some of your files locally. And then finally down here, recent files, the list can contain up to 20 files. I would leave that. You could adjust it lower or higher depending on your preference, but generally speaking, 20 is a solid number, and rarely would you be going through your recent files to find something that's more than 20 files old. So that should be good. Quick export settings, we can just leave all of this, but performance is my next big thing that I wanted to share with you guys. So Photoshop is a massive program. It takes up a ton of storage, a ton of memory usage. It is a beast, right? And on our MacBooks, we don't have the most amount of RAM that you would get in a professional setting. Photoshop automatically will try and use 70% of your computer's RAM, right? And that's a pretty solid number, but sometimes it can eat up a lot of space, especially when you're trying to run other pieces of software. Illustrator and InDesign also tend to eat up a lot of RAM, and so does Google Chrome. So just be mindful of this. If you're working on really small projects, or really small files, I should say, towards, at the beginning of your career, maybe you're mostly a web designer or things like that, you might be able to lower the amount of RAM your computer uses because you're not creating as large of a file size. That being said, generally, because you guys are still in school and you're doing a myriad of different projects, I would still just leave this at 70% and be aware that other softwares might be running at the same time and just generally slowing your computer down. Okay. If you guys have a graphics card or a graphics processor in your machine, I think most of you should because you're using newer models, make sure this use graphics processor option is checked on. What this is basically doing is it's taking all of the hard work off of your CPU or your Intel chip or whatever the equivalent is in Apple world, and it is switching it to your graphics processing card, okay? And your graphics processing card is what is basically generating all of the information to create anything visual you see on your screen. So that's a big setting because it's allowing your computer and your RAM to do the technical work while allowing the graphics processor to create the visual elements. The next thing under advanced settings, make sure all of these things are turned on. Using graphics processor to accelerate computation, this will speed up Photoshop's performance insane. OpenCL is just a visual programming language. Make sure you're using that. And then these other two options are good to use as well. 30-bit display just means that you're going to be able to view very color-rich images on your computer within Photoshop. So as you sort of get further into your expertise, you might find, again, you're a strong web UI designer, and that's mostly what you're doing. You can optimize Photoshop for these things. If you just do standard Photoshop work or you deal with a lot of photos, you can do that too. Or maybe you, for some reason, work on a lot of billboards and massive real world sort of advertisements. That is a file called a PSB, and you could optimize Photoshop for that purpose as well. The next thing here that I'd like to point out, this is probably going to be pretty useful for you as a beginner, history states. The more history states you have, the more RAM it's going to take up because it's going to take memory to remember all of those history states and all of the sort of choices that you're making. So be aware that the higher this number is, the slower Photoshop might operate, but it can almost act as an insurance policy, right? So if you get too far down a rabbit hole, you might be able to fix something pretty quickly, which is nice. I leave mine around 50 just because I don't really need to go back and make a lot of history adjustments. So 50 seems to be a solid number for me to go back and make any changes I need. Cache levels. This is your Photoshop cache data. The higher your cache, the larger the file size it will create on your computer. Photoshop stores cache data within its application sort of folders. So if you make this number higher, I think it can go up to 8. The larger that file will be, but the more information it stores and the ability to retain more information you'll have. Subsequently, you can go lower and it will create a lower cache size. So again, it just depends on the type of files you're working on. Larger files, you might want a smaller cache because they're generally just large files to begin with. And smaller files, such as web design stuff, you might want to leave that up higher. But again, since we're all sort of general usage right now, let's just leave that at 4 and we'll be cool. Scratch disk. I doubt any of you guys have a scratch disk unless you're working on some sort of custom setup. But if you guys had a really awesome computer, you might have a second hard drive that you can tell Photoshop to write scratch disk information to. Again, this would just speed up your computer, but for now, we're just sitting here with our Macintosh HD, or if you're on a PC, that might say local C or something like that. Units and rulers. This is where you can change your units of measurement. If you want to work in anything other than inches, it's right there. Your type in anything other than points. If you do a lot of package design, type in millimeters is pretty useful to have, so you could switch that too. Or if you work in web design, type in pixels might be useful too. Totally up to you though. And I think that's probably it for your preferences. So with that being said, I hope you guys sort of find what works best for you. Feel free to play around with things like your interface and your workspace and sort of get a handle on what you like in Photoshop. And I'll catch you in the next video.